It is a wet Tuesday night in November 1962 on London's North Circular Road. The air inside the Transport Cafe hangs heavy with the thick, comforting scent of cheap tobacco, frying bacon, and damp wool. A coin drops into the jukebox. The mechanism whirs, and the aggressive, stuttering opening riff of a Gene Vincent track cuts through the clatter of teacups. But the real music is happening outside. In the oily darkness of the car park, illuminated only by the dull yellow glow of the street lamps, a young man in black leather performs a sacred ritual. He leans over his machine, tickles the carburetor until a drop of fuel hits his finger, finds the compression stroke, and kicks down hard. The silence of the suburbs is shattered by the guttural, rhythmic thunder of a 650cc parallel twin engine waking up. It vibrates through the soles of his boots and rattles the windows of the cafe. For the neighbors peering nervously from behind their curtains, this is a noise of terror, but for him, shivering in the cold, damp air, it is the only sound of freedom that matters. To understand the roar of the Norton and the triumph on the British High Street, you first have to understand the suffocating silence that preceded it. Britain in the late 1950s was not yet the technicolor playground of the swinging 60s. It was a country painted in sepia tones, still shaking off the dust of the Second World War. The cities were landscapes of soot-blackened brick and bomb sites that had been turned into makeshift car parks. For the parents of this generation, life was about security, respectability, and quiet fortitude. They had survived the Blitz and rationing, and their dream was a steady job, a paid-off mortgage, and a peaceful Sunday afternoon. But for their children, born during the war or just after, peaceful felt a lot like dead. This was the first generation in British history to grow up without the looming threat of conscription. For decades, the path for a working-class lad was predetermined. You left school at 15, you got an apprenticeship, and at 18, you were marched off to do your national service. 2 years of bulling boots, saluting officers, and having your individuality shouted out of you by a sergeant major. It was the state's way of breaking wild colts, but in 1960, the last conscripts were called up. Suddenly, thousands of young, fit, aggression-filled men were released into civilian life with no war to fight and no drill instructor to fear. Coinciding with this release was an economic shift that would change the social fabric of the UK. The austerity of the post-war years was melting away. Factories in Birmingham, Coventry, and Manchester were booming, churning out cars and steel, and they needed labor. A young man leaving school could walk into a job on a Monday morning and, by Friday, hold a pay packet that his father could only have dreamed of at the same age. For the first time, the teenager wasn't just a small adult. He was a consumer with disposable income. He didn't have to hand every penny over to his mother for the housekeeping. He had 5 or 6 pounds burning a hole in the pocket of his denim jeans. However, having money and having somewhere to spend it were two very different things. The Britain of the early 1960s was completely unprepared for this new demographic. The pubs were grim, carpeted establishments, closing strictly at 10:30 p.m., populated by men in flat caps drinking mild and discussing cricket. They didn't want loud, energetic youths in their locals. The dance halls were often stiff, formal affairs run by people who thought the waltz was the height of culture. There was a massive disconnect between the energy of the youth, fed on a diet of imported American rock and roll records and Hollywood movies, and the sleepy, curtain-twitching reality of the British suburbs. This generation didn't want to be like their dads. They rejected the demob suits, the pipe smoking, and the deferential tipping of the hat to the local squire. They looked across the Atlantic and saw Marlon Brando in The Wild One, brooding and dangerous in leather. They saw James Dean, cool and tragic. They wanted a piece of that danger. They wanted to shock the neighbors who had spent 20 years trying to keep everything nice. And in the booming industrial heartlands of the Midlands, the answer to their boredom was rolling off the production lines in chrome and steel, ready to be bought on the never hire purchase schemes that were suddenly available to anyone with a wage slip. If the motorcycle was the vehicle of their rebellion, the transport cafe was their cathedral. In the early 1960s, Britain did not have diners in the American sense. We didn't have chrome-plated milk bars serving thick shakes and burgers to smiling teenagers in Letterman jackets. We had the CAF. These were utilitarian, greasy spoon shacks dotted along the great arterial roads. The A1, the A5, and the legendary North Circular. Originally built to serve long-distance lorry drivers, hauling steel and coal across the country, they were places of steam, strip lighting, and formica tables that were bolted to the floor. But for the young motorcyclist, the cafe was the only sanctuary available. By 1961, most respectable establishments had hung signs on their doors that read, "No leather, no denim." The biker was a pariah, viewed with suspicion by publicans and cinema managers alike. The transport cafe, however, didn't care what you wore as long as you had sixpence for a cup of tea. It was open 24 hours a day, it was warm, and crucially, it was loud. The Ace Cafe on the North Circular became the Vatican of this new religion. It was a stark, flat-roofed white building that looked more like a concrete bunker than a social club, but on a Friday night, it transformed into a neon-lit hive of activity. The air inside was a unique cocktail of frying sausages, damp leather drying in the heat, and the acrid smoke of Capstan full-strength cigarettes. But the heartbeat of the Ace, and every cafe like it, was the jukebox. The jukebox was the altar. For 3 pence, you could buy 3 minutes of pure, undistilled American aggression. Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, Chuck Berry. This was music that your parents wouldn't allow in the house. In the cafe, played at ear-splitting volume, it became the soundtrack to a new way of life. The rockers didn't just listen to the music, they lived it. They leaned against the walls, mimicking the slouch of their idols, nursing mugs of tea that were more sugar than water, energy fuel for the cold rides ahead. It is important to remember that this British interpretation of the biker was a strange hybrid. They were desperate to emulate the sun-drenched, open-road freedom they saw in American movies like The Wild One, but they were living in a country of constant rain, roundabout traffic systems, and industrial smog. They took the American leather jacket, the Bronx or the Perfecto, and adapted it to the British climate. They added thick sea boot socks folded over the top of their boots to stop the frostbite. They wore white silk scarves, not as a fashion statement, but because at 80 miles per hour on the Watford bypass, the wind could cut your neck like a knife. In these cafes, a hierarchy emerged. You weren't just a kid with a bike, you were a ton-up boy. The name itself was a challenge. To do the ton meant hitting the magic 100 miles per hour mark. In 1960, on roads with no speed limits but terrible surfaces, on bikes with drum brakes that were barely functional, this was a feat of madness. The cafe became the staging ground for these attempts. It was where you bragged about the near misses, where you compared the scars on your bike and your body, and where the tribes of the road began to solidify into something that would terrify the nation. The cafe was no longer just a place to eat. It was a fortress, and outside in the car park, the cavalry was assembling. To be a rocker in the 1960s was to be an amateur engineer, a mechanic, and a test pilot all rolled into one. The machines they rode were not the reliable push-button appliances we know today. They were heavy, thumping beasts of British iron, Triumphs, Nortons, BSAs, and Ariels, built in the industrial heartlands of the Midlands. They leaked oil as a matter of course. They vibrated so violently they could loosen your fillings, and starting one on a cold morning required a specific, almost magical combination of tickling the carburetor, finding the compression stroke, and delivering a kick that could break your ankle if the engine fired back. But the stock bike, as it rolled out of the showroom, was never enough. The rocker didn't want a commuter vehicle. He wanted a racing machine. And so, in freezing cold sheds and back gardens across the UK, the Cafe Racer was born. This wasn't a style you could buy off the shelf. It was a look you had to build with a spanner in your hand. They stripped everything unnecessary to save weight. Heavy steel mudguards, bulky dual seats, and chain guards were tossed onto the scrap heap. The handlebars were the first thing to go. They were replaced with clip-ons, short, stubby bars attached directly to the front forks, forcing the rider down low over the tank in a streamlined, aerodynamic crouch. Footrests were moved back using rear sets, pushing the rider's knees up and back. The result was a riding position that was uncomfortable at 30 miles per hour, but perfect at 100. They added swept-back exhaust pipes that angled upwards and a single humped racing seat that made it clear this bike was built for speed, not for carrying passengers. The ultimate expression of this mechanical obsession was the Triton. It was the Frankenstein monster of the rocker scene, a mythical beast created by combining the two best components the British industry had to offer. They took the powerful, reliable twin-cylinder engine from a Triumph Bonneville and wrestled it into the legendary feather bed frame of a Norton, widely considered the best handling chassis in the world. The result was a hybrid that handled like a dream and pulled like a train. To own a Triton was to be royalty at the Ace Cafe. It showed you weren't just a rider. You were a craftsman who understood the dark alchemy of metal and oil. If the bike was the sword, the leather jacket was the shield, but it was also a uniform that screamed identity. In the early 60s, you couldn't just walk into a high-street shop and buy a biker jacket. You had to go to specialist suppliers, the most holy of which was D. Lewis Leathers, on Great Portland Street in London. To own a genuine Bronx or Lightning jacket was the ultimate status symbol. It cost a fortune, often a month's wages, but it was built to survive a slide down the tarmac at 80 miles per hour. These jackets became canvases. Rockers decorated them with silver studs, spelling out the names of their gangs, their girlfriends, or simply the make of their bike. Triumph or Norton hammered into the back panel in jagged metal. They pinned badges from the Isle of Man TT races on their lapels and sewed the yellow and black patch of the 59 Club onto the arm. The leather was stiff, heavy, and smelled of the road. And they didn't clean them. A layer of oil, dead flies, and road grime was known as character. It earned them the derogatory nickname from the press and the public, greasers, a title they adopted with a sneering pride. Underneath the leather, the uniform was strictly practical. Thick, creamy white sea boot socks, often bought from Navy surplus stores, were folded over the top of heavy engineer boots or gold-top boots. This wasn't a fashion statement. It was the only way to stop the freezing British wind from biting your ankles on a long ride. Around the neck, the white silk scarf was ubiquitous. Again, born of necessity to prevent the rough collar of the leather jacket from chafing the neck raw during a burn-up, it became the dashing flair of the Cafe Racer, fluttering behind them like a medieval banner. We must not forget the women of this world. The rocker birds were as tough as the men. With beehive hairstyles lacquered rock hard with a hairspray to survive a helmet, and eyeliner applied thick enough to withstand the wind, they were a terrifyingly glamorous presence. While many rode pillion, clinging to the waist of a boyfriend, a significant number bought and rode their own machines. They wore the same leather, swore the same oaths, and drank the same tea. In a society that still expected young women to be demure secretaries waiting for marriage, a girl kick-starting a 500cc BSA outside a transport cafe was a radical, feminist statement, even if she didn't know it at the time. The obsession that drove this entire subculture, the holy grail that every rocker chased, could be summed up in a single, terrifying phrase: doing the ton. Today, 100 miles per hour is a speed easily achieved by a family hatchback on a motorway. But in 1962, on a public road, on a motorcycle with drum brakes the size of saucers and tires made of hard, unforgiving rubber, it was an act of insanity. It was the barrier that separated the men from the boys, the coffee bar cowboys, from the true ton-up boys. To understand the fear and the glory of doing the ton, you have to understand the machinery. At 100 Menaba, a modified Triumph Bonneville or Norton Dominator was screaming in protest. The vibration was so intense that vision became blurred. The primitive suspension chattered over every bump in the road, threatening to throw the rider into the hedge. And the brakes? At that speed, the brakes were little more than a suggestion. You didn't stop a bike doing the ton. You just hoped you had enough road to slow down before the roundabout appeared out of the gloom. The legend of record racing was born from this lust for speed. The story goes that a rider would put a coin in the jukebox, usually selecting a track around 2 or 3 minutes long, something fast and aggressive like Eddie Cochran's Something Else. As the needle hit the vinyl, they would sprint to their bike, kickstart it, and race to a designated point, a bridge, a roundabout, or a junction, and speed back to the cafe before the song ended. While the reality of these races was often exaggerated by the press, the spirit of them was very real. It was a duel between the machine, the road, and the music. But this adrenaline came at a terrible price. The roads of 1960s Britain were not lit like they are today. They were dark, narrow, and often slick with oil and rain. There were no central barriers, and the other road users, drivers in slow-moving Austin A40s or Morris Minors, had no concept of a motorcycle approaching them at triple-digit speeds. They would pull out of a junction, seeing only a single dim yellow headlight in the distance, thinking they had plenty of time. They didn't. The result was carnage. Every weekend, the cafes would fall silent as news of another crash filtered in. There was a grim, stoic acceptance of death among the ton-up boys. They didn't have counselors or grief circles. If a mate bought the farm, a slang term for a fatal crash, his chair at the table would sit empty the next night, a silent memorial amidst the noise of the jukebox. They would raise a cup of tea, perhaps mutter, "Poor sod," and then go back to discussing gear ratios or carburetor settings. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that death was the admission price for the life they had chosen. They were living fast in a grey world, and the danger was the only thing that made them feel truly alive. The press called them the Suicide Club, and for many young men in black leather, tragically, that name was entirely accurate. Amidst this atmosphere of death, danger, and public hatred, salvation came from the most unlikely of places. It didn't come from a government program or a youth worker, but from a middle-aged, bespectacled priest in Hackney named Father Bill Shergold. Father Bill was the vicar of the Eton Mission, a crumbling Victorian church in the rough East End of London. He had noticed the leather-clad youths roaring past his church every night, treated like lepers by the rest of society. Instead of condemning them from the pulpit, he did something radical. He bought a motorbike. It was a small, humble machine, but it was an olive branch. He rode it nervously to the Ace Cafe one evening in 1962, handing out leaflets inviting the ton-up boys to a church service dedicated to them. The cafe fell silent. The tough guys in the corner, who had been in fights with the police and terrified entire towns, looked at this small man in a dog collar with bewilderment. They expected a lecture. Instead, they got an invitation. On the night of the service, Father Bill waited anxiously in his empty church. He feared that no one would come, or worse, that they would come to mock him. Then he heard it. A low rumble in the distance that grew into a roar, shaking the stained glass windows in their lead frames. They came in their thousands. The narrow streets of Hackney were gridlocked with Triumphs, Nortons, and BSAs. The scene inside the church was surreal. The pews, usually occupied by little old ladies in hats, were packed with young men in oil-stained leather and girls in denim. Helmets were placed reverently on the altar. The smell of incense mixed with the smell of castor oil and damp leather. They sat in respectful silence as Father Bill blessed their bikes and, more importantly, treated them like human beings. For the first time, someone from the establishment wasn't telling them to cut their hair or sell their bikes. He was telling them that they mattered. From this service, the 59 Club was born. It started as a church youth club, but quickly exploded into the largest motorcycle club in the world. At its peak, it had over 20,000 members. The round yellow and black patch with the number 59 became a badge of honor, sewn onto the arms of leather jackets across the country. It wasn't a gang. It was a sanctuary. It offered a place to go that wasn't a cold cafe or a street corner. It offered table football, music, and a warm cup of tea without judgment. This was the turning point. The 59 Club didn't tame the rockers. They still rode fast and lived hard, but it gave them a center. It proved to the nation that beneath the grease and the swagger, these hooligans were just young men and women looking for a community that would accept them. It was a brief, golden moment where the church and the rebels stood side by side, united by the love of two wheels. But even as the 59 Club flourished, the world outside was changing faster than a Triumph Bonneville at full throttle. The era of the British rocker was about to face a threat that no amount of prayer or horsepower could defeat. The end of the rocker era didn't come with a bang, nor with a final, glorious battle against the mods. Instead, it arrived with a polite, high-pitched hum from the east. By the mid-1960s, the British motorcycle industry, the giants of Triumph, Norton, and BSA, had become arrogant and complacent. They believed that a real rider would always want a bike that vibrated, leaked oil, and required a master's degree in mechanics to keep running. They sold character, but the world was starting to crave reliability. The first cracks appeared with the arrival of the small Japanese commuter bikes, the Honda Cubs and Super Cubs, but the death blow was struck in 1969, a year that marked the definitive end of the decade and the culture. Honda unveiled the CB750. It was a machine that seemed to come from the future. It had 4 cylinders. It didn't leak a drop of oil. It had a disc brake that actually stopped the bike in the rain, and most humiliating of all, it had an electric starter button. For the die-hard rocker, accustomed to the ritual of the kick-start, the sweating, the swearing, the physical exertion required to bring a beast to life, the electric button was an insult. It was soft, but for the rest of the world, it was a revelation. Suddenly, you didn't need to be a grease-stained mechanic to ride a motorcycle. You could just push a button and go. The marketing slogan for Honda said it all. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. It was a direct, calculated attack on the leather-clad bad boy image of the British rocker. As the Japanese machines flooded the market, the great British factories began to crumble. They couldn't compete with the precision engineering and the low prices of the imports. One by one, the legendary Marquez went bankrupt or merged into oblivion. The supply of cheap, thunderous British iron that had fueled the cafe racer movement dried up. The new generation of kids didn't want a second-hand Norton that needed fixing every weekend. They wanted a shiny, reliable Yamaha that started first time, every time. The landscape of the roads changed too. The great arterial highways were being sanitized. Speed limits were enforced with new technology, and the motorways drew traffic away from the old cafe stops. The final, heartbreaking nail in the coffin came in September 1969, when the Ace Cafe, the spiritual home of the ton-up boy, the Vatican of the culture, shut its doors. The jukebox fell silent, the smell of frying bacon faded, and the building was converted into a tire depot. To stand in the car park of the Ace in late 1969 was to stand in a graveyard. The roar had gone, replaced by the efficient, soulless hum of modern traffic. The 1960s were over, and the rockers found themselves stranded in a new decade that had no place for their oil-stained nostalgia. Culturally, the rocker didn't disappear. He was devoured by fashion. As the 1970s rolled in, the very image that had once terrified old ladies, the black leather jacket, the studs, the boots, was stripped of its danger and sold back to the public as cool. The punk movement of the late 70s adopted the leather jacket, but they covered it in paint and safety pins, listening to music that was angry in a political way the rockers never were. The specific mechanical purity of the cafe racer scene was diluted into a costume. By the 1980s and 90s, motorcycling itself underwent a complete class shift. In the 1960s, you rode a motorbike because you couldn't afford a car. It was working-class transport for the poor. But as cars became cheaper and bikes became more expensive, leisure toys, the demographic flipped. The ton-up boy was replaced by the born-again biker, middle-aged men with mortgages and secure jobs, buying expensive machines to recapture a youth they might never have actually lived. The cafe racer style eventually returned, of course. Today, you can walk into a dealership and buy a brand new Triumph that looks exactly like a 1960s Bonneville. It has fuel injection disguised as carburetors and electric starters hidden away to look like old casings. You can buy a vintage leather jacket that has been pre-distressed in a factory to look like it's been dragged down the North Circular without ever having to shiver in the rain to earn those scuffs. While it is wonderful that the machines are still celebrated, something vital was lost in this gentrification. The threat is gone. A modern cafe racer is a thing of beauty, often parked outside a coffee shop serving flat whites rather than a transport cafe serving stewed tea. The raw, greasy, desperate edge of the original movement, where you built your bike because you had no money and you rode fast because you had no future, cannot be manufactured. The tribes of the road have vanished. You no longer see 50 rockers huddled together under a bridge on the A1, sharing cigarettes and spark plugs. The solitary nature of modern life has crept into biking too. We have heated grips, GPS navigation, and Gore-Tex suits that keep us perfectly dry. We are comfortable, we are safe, and we are sensible. But looking back at the grainy black and white photos of the Ace Cafe in 1964, at those young faces smeared with oil and defiance, you have to wonder if, in gaining all this comfort, we lost the very soul of the experience. If you drive down the North Circular Road today, the ghosts are hard to find. The Ace Cafe has been reopened, beautifully restored as a tribute to the past, hosting meetups for enthusiasts who polish their chrome with pride. But the road itself, once a dark, dangerous ribbon of asphalt where legends were made between traffic lights, is now a clogged artery of speed cameras and commuter traffic. The specific, violent acoustics of a Norton Manx roaring through the tunnel at midnight have been replaced by the steady drone of diesel delivery vans. It is easy to romanticize the rockers, to look at the old photographs and see only the style, the white scarves, the leather, the rebellious pout. But we must remember the grit that lay underneath. This was a generation who grew up in a country that was often cold, broke, and restrictive. They didn't have much, so they built what they needed. They took rusty, discarded machinery and turned it into gold. They found freedom not in an airline ticket or a digital screen, but in the physical, vibrating reality of an engine they had tuned with their own freezing hands. There is a sadness in realizing that we will likely never see their kind again. We live in a disposable age now. If something breaks, we throw it away. If we are cold, we turn up the heating. The rockers lived in a time when you fixed what was broken and you endured the cold because the destination was worth it. They were the last generation to truly understand the relationship between man and machine, a relationship built on oil, sweat, and the constant risk of failure. The ton-up boys may have grey hair now, or they may have ridden on to that great cafe in the sky, but for a brief, thundering moment in the 1960s, they owned the night. They took the monochrome world of post-war Britain and tore it open with a kickstart lever. And if you listen carefully, standing on a roadside on a quiet Sunday morning, you might just catch the faint echo of a parallel twin engine fading into the distance. The sound of a time when freedom was something you had to build for yourself, one bolt at a time.